Welcome to Novara FM. I'm Eleanor Penny. When we were all clammed up in the mass private delirium of COVID lockdowns, there was a lot to miss. I was longing for gigs and marketplaces and festivals and clubs and protests, inching your way through the throng at a pub, the streets of Soho on a Saturday night. It wasn't just about the people I already knew and loved, although of course I missed them too. It was about the experience of being in a big mass of strangers, of being one with the crowd. I wasn't alone in that longing. Billions of people were desperately trying to find some proxy to crowd experiences online, but it wasn't ever a real replacement. So if in-person mass civic life is so fundamental to our experience of being a person alive in the world today, then we're left with the question, why do crowds get such bad press? Take a look at the headlines hand-wringing about mob mentality, herd logic, faceless baying crowds. You'd be forgiven for thinking that human beings might be fine on their own, but get them together in a big group and you are asking for trouble. And indeed, since the explosion of urban populations during the Industrial Revolution, crowds have been talked about with suspicion. The mass and the mob spread violence, spread disease, spread moral contagion, and they need to be swiftly dispersed or contained. So where did this attitude come from? How does it show up in our politics? How should we be thinking about political assemblies of all stripes? And how does the experience of crowd life change us? This week I'm joined by Dan Hancox, author of Multitudes, How Crowds Made the Modern World. It looks at the social and political history of mass assemblies, taking in football crowds, student protests, the Tottenham riots, music festivals, as well as the Nuremberg rallies of Nazi Germany and the throngs of QAnon-pilled far-right Americans who stormed the Capitol building on January the 6th of 2021. Dan Hancox is a journalist writing for The Guardian, The Observer, The New York Times and more. He's the co-host of the podcast Cursed Objects and the author of two other books, Inner City Pressure, The Story of Grime, and The Village Against the World. We talked about collective joy, the Paris Commune and the Hillsborough disaster, about Spanish street festivals and far-right riots, and the evolution of modern policing. Dan, hello, welcome.
Hi Eleanor, how are you?
I'm doing great. Shana tova.
And shout out over to you too.
So, you talk about the genesis of this project during COVID lockdowns, and I would love to hear more about that and maybe how that relates to your other work and writing that really focuses on like the city, the experience of the urban.
You know, I spent the first COVID lockdown, as so many of us did, in a space that was too small for, what was it, 6 weeks or so. Very quickly during that first COVID lockdown in 2020, I realised, that I was missing not only my friends and family, as I did a great deal, wondering when we'd get to see them again, but also strangers and sort of mass congregation. And I think this brought into focus the fact that all of my work pretty much for my entire freelance writing career, whether it was reporting on riots or protests or as a music journalist going to sort of massive festivals or Notting Hill Carnival, involved a lot of thinking about and experiencing everything from crowd joy to crowd rage to go to football matches and seeing how crowds were policed there, how protest crowds were policed. But there was one specific moment in the pandemic that really, really brought it all into focus, and it was when I read a news story about residents of Leith on the outskirts of Edinburgh opening their windows and singing the song Sunshine on Leith together.
Oh.
It was really poignant. I think they've been inspired possibly. Similar things were happening in small towns in Italy where they were probably singing Nessun Dorma or something, right?
You're like, what do Italians do when I'm not looking, when I'm not supervising?
Exactly. But yes, in Edinburgh, in Leith, they were singing the Proclaimers song Sunshine on Leith. And to my shame, as a sort of recovering music journalist, I didn't actually know this song. I'm not that au fait with the work of the Proclaimers. And so I looked it up and immediately found a video on YouTube, or a series of videos on YouTube of fans of the Edinburgh-based team, or Leith-based team really, Hibernian, singing Sunshine on Leith en masse. So while it is very sweetly sung, this love song by the two lads in the Proclaimers, that is nothing compared to hearing 25,000 perhaps less well-trained singers singing it together with one voice, and it blew me away. Like, I cried. I watched it again and again and again. I found it extremely addictive. I started watching other videos of football fans singing. I started looking up videos of crowd sing-alongs from music festivals, including some extremely cheesy and embarrassing stuff. Like, there are some great videos of Mr. Brightside being sung by the crowd, and I'm really endangering any shred of credibility I might have here by saying that. But there is something really magical about seeing the crowd joining in one voice and their sort of failings as individual singers being submerged in the whole, and becoming greater than the sum of their parts, essentially.
So you talk about how crowds made the modern world, the sort of subtitle of the book. Can you talk about your periodization here? Like, what do you mean by modern, and what is that link that you're trying to get at between like masses, crowds, the throng, and your definition of modernity? Because this is a word that gets thrown around a lot and people mean different things by it, right?
Yeah. It was a job made easy. Like, I did a history degree, so I think a lot about periodization. When do you start? When do you end? It's extremely important. It's often driven by your own politics, in fact.
Right.
It was actually a job that became quite easy for me once I started reading about the history of crowd theory, and it fell into focus quite cleanly, because the founder of crowd theory, a man I'm sure we will talk about because he is the sort of pantomime villain of my book, a man called Gustave Le Bon, who wrote the seminal work on this subject, called simply The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. He wrote that book in the 1890s, but it became very clear to me reading about, not just his work, but like about his life, that he had his own sort of epiphanic moment. If mine was watching videos on YouTube of football fans singing, Gustave Le Bon's epiphanic moment was being in Paris during the Commune, having recently, having sort of barely got over being an ambulanceman during the Franco-Prussian War, in which he would have seen horrible, horrible things. Much as I don't like the man, wouldn't wish that on anybody. Like, he would have seen horrible gore and gristle, returned to Paris thinking, well, the war is at least over, even if we lost. And immediately saw his beloved Paris engulfed by flames, and in the tumult of revolution, of grassroots revolution from the bottom up. That did not accord with his politics at all. And he reasoned that the only possible explanation for what he saw was that the people of Paris had gone mad. They joined the crowd and they'd become deranged. They become bestial. They become primitive. They become animals. And that is the basis of all crowd theory. It begins in 1871, which is when a lot of history books periodize from that moment anyway. There's a lot of changes begin at that particular moment, 1870 or 1871, with the end of the Franco-Prussian War. It's sort of, it fits because modernity is looming. I mean, this is what Gustave Le Bon and other people on the European conservative, I guess we'd say right now, but just European conservatives, people who believed in the ancien regime or some sort of hierarchical order, the power of the church, the power of institutions, the power of great men to rule over the masses. They saw the surging kind of interest in feminism, democracy, socialism, anarchism. These things were spreading along with the literacy that was spreading across Europe at this particular moment. And it terrified the establishment, it terrified the elites. Democracy in particular was on the march. Trade union, membership was surging as well. You had left-wing parties beginning to form. Everything that the believers in hierarchical order held dear was beginning to be threatened, and it was being threatened from below by the crowd, essentially. By this sort of phantom Bastille crowd almost that sort of had lived in the imagination throughout the 19th century, that they were going to come back and finish the job, basically, and that everyone else's heads were going to end up on spikes as well.
So talk to us more about this fella, Gustave Le Bon, and how his experiences of the Paris Commune shaped what we can kind of see today as an almost definitional suspicion of crowds. You talk about how there's very few words in the English language for things like crowd, throng, herd, whatever it is, that don't carry like a shimmer of suspicion or pejorative about them. So
Absolutely.
What's his role there, and how does he frame the crowd?
Yeah, as you say, like, our language is absolutely full of pejoratives for crowd behaviour. And the contention of my book, the argument of my book, is that things like mob mentality simply don't exist. That basically the word mob is a very little analytical descriptive use at all. Those are the ideas. The idea of the mad mob, the idea of herd mentality, the idea that we lose our, so Gustave Le Bon argues very, very plainly in his extremely influential, and it cannot be emphasized enough how influential his book was, The Crowd, A Study of a Popular Mind, immediately translated into loads of languages, into, I think 19 languages within a year or two, sold millions of copies, was read by it was read by future dictators, as I'll get to in a minute. Possibly one of the most influential works of psychology ever written. So its impact, and he's still cited today approvingly. He never did any empirical work, I'd say, to begin with. Like
vibes-based methodology only. Yeah,
it fully was. And those vibes were seeing the Tuileries Palace in Paris set on fire during the Paris Commune in 1871. His vibes were fear and hostility to the menacing kind of rise of the crowd. And he believed that, I think this is a direct quote, forgive me if I'm paraphrasing from memory, but even the most civilized man, upon entering into a crowd, will become deranged, essentially. That you could be a man of great education and learning, really have your wits about you, but it is upon entering the crowd that you will lose all of that sort of power for reason, essentially. And this is something that we see throughout the 20th century, is the idea that people, when the individual is capable of rational thought, once they join together in a crowd, they lose both any responsibility for their actions, which is not true, but also their ability to make decisions that accord with their own values, which is also not true. Like, the fundamental idea is that you could be someone who is completely opposed to any form of violence. You could be the greatest peacenik who ever lived, but you join a crowd of roaring, angry protesters who are throwing bricks, and through the magic of contagion, of crowd contagion, you pick up a brick and throw a brick as well, because that is the magnetic and fearful kind of potential that every crowd has. It's just not true. That isn't how people behave in crowds. We do now have sort of serious, in-depth studies that have been done by a bunch of really clever and interesting academics in the last 20 or 30 years, but it is an extremely difficult set of ideas to challenge, because it supports those in power. Like, it's something we see in media coverage of every protest right up to the moment. When Suella Braverman talks about hate marches, describing what I have experienced repeatedly on the Palestine solidarity demos as some of the most peaceful and family-orientated marches that I've ever been on. Hate is an extraordinary word to throw at them, but it's not extraordinary, and it is in line with elite ideology about the crowd, which is always up to no good, is always prone to violence, and that its bad behaviours are contagious, infectious. They're a pathogen, essentially.
Let's talk about methodology here, because it's really interesting to call it a book of psychology, not least because it comes about in the 1890s, right? Extremely early on in the field that we might now recognise as psychology. And it's also pulling on other ideas that are swirling around in the firmament of the era very fundamentally. So about eugenics, race science, class science. And as we see so often in our history-orientated Novara FMs, someone somewhere is always measuring someone's skull. And that seems like kind of fundamental to the articulation of what the crowd is, who the crowd is, how the crowd behaves, a sort of strange kind of racialization of people en masse that doesn't quite apply to people individually.
Yes, absolutely. The late 19th century is a moment in which the emerging field of sort of group psychology or crowd psychology is completely interwoven with criminology and this idea that there is a criminal class and a criminal mind. There was a great deal of interest, a great deal of intellectual work going on trying to understand what the swarming subaltern masses of the great cities of Europe were up to, essentially, and through, everything from skull measurements to, there were photographic projects as well. It's also worth emphasizing the sheer size of population explosion in the cities of like Europe and the US in particular in the late 19th century. We're talking sort of a factor of 5 or 10 increase in the space of 50 years in a lot of cases. So it's worth remembering that just cities were a lot fuller than they had ever had been before. So there was this pressed the concern on the elites that were based in cities like whether it's London or New York or Paris. And Gustave Le Bon built on racist phrenology and so forth, and his work directly fed into fascist ideology. I mean, he died in 1933, I think, but he had a direct relationship with. He was read by Goebbels, who was a great admirer of his work. He was probably read by Hitler, and there is actually a German academic who has written a paper that claims to have proven that, I don't read German, but claims to have proven that Hitler paraphrased in Mein Kampf bits directly from the crowd. The most certainty about in terms of connections between fascism and traditional crowd theory, as it's sometimes referred to, is that Mussolini was such a big fan that he, on a number of occasions in speeches and interviews, extolled the virtues of Gustave Le Bon's work, and then they became pen pals. They wrote letters to each other, what people did at the time, but I like referring to them as pen pals. and then eventually friends, and it was in places, the crowd, Gustave Le Bon's book, was actually sort of an instruction manual for how Mussolini, used rhetoric to sort of sweep the crowd along. So the idea that, something must be done about the swarming subaltern masses of the great cities fed directly into, or the analytical kind of work of people like Gustave Le Bon, building on criminology, building on, phrenology, then builds directly into an ideology that says, well, the only way that we can deal with the, emergent masses is to try and canalize these wild, anarchic, pro-democratic, pro-socialist energies into something that we can control and which supports the kind of political organization, the political system we believe in, which is the Caesar, the great man, the dictator, the despot at the top. The analytical work was frequently racist. I mean, it's also, like Gustave Le Bon himself was a great believer in race science. I mean, really horrible stuff. He also describes crowds as having feminine qualities innately. So the state of becoming naive and sort of influenceable and weak in terms of your sense of self-control, he identified as feminine qualities. So men, when they enter the crowd, become more feminine in their lack of self-control as individuals. It's good stuff, isn't it? It's an extraordinary read. He's quite a good writer as well. It's just insane and without any empirical basis.
Some people manage to exist in history in this really kind of acute way when you're like, I can't believe there's just one guy who just wrote it all down. Yeah. Catalogued these different social forces in a way that feels like very acute. I want to come back to sort of the spectacle of the fascist demonstration and what, if any, is the overlap with the kind of democratic crowd in a bit. First of all, I'd like to talk about how your book seems to me a kind of shadow history of organised state violence as well, which kind of co-evolves alongside in response to the crowd. And what you were saying earlier about Gustave Le Bon's army experiences is really kind of striking to me, because his experience of like the crowd is this experience of mass violence, right? Because he was in the army, right? And there is a repeated theme whereby the violence of policing gets identified with the violence of the crowd, and through these kind of very extreme collective punishment techniques to securitize the masses, which are justified as necessary because of the violence of the crowd, right? It's a very kind of self-reinforcing thing. And this seems really key to digging into what you mean by modernity, not just as like a time period, but as like an experience. Because we have the necessity of masses of people for factories and cities, for the necessities of mass extraction that allow capitalism to continue. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see the role of policing in your historiography here, and like its role in the creation of modernity?
It's no coincidence that organised police forces emerge in the 19th century at the same time that you're getting a growing kind of surge of interest in mass participation in politics. That Peterloo is a critical point in the history of the creation of the British police force. Peterloo in Manchester was named the name attributed to the mass rally in St. Peter's Fields that were then cracked down on with military force, essentially, and led to a lot of led to the death of a number of the murder of a number of those protesters who were assembling peacefully. There's a decent Mike Leigh film about it. It then, that triggers a lot of the conversations about policing. It's worth noting that from the very beginning of the creation of the first British police force, the Metropolitan Police, that ideas were being imported from the British Empire, or rather re-imported, having been exported in the first place. This is sometimes referred to as the colonial boomerang, and this continues way into the 20th century as a sort of method that the othered colonial crowd, whether it's in Amritsar or in Delhi, is essentially experimented on with extreme violence. And those techniques were often very directly brought back to the metropole, to Great Britain, having been tried out elsewhere. This goes on right up until the 1980s, when the experience of the policing in the north of Ireland, via the Royal Ulster Constabulary, there's a lot of like direct transfer of both skills and policies and even individuals into particularly the Metropolitan Police, but senior levels of British policing, having experimented using things like snatch squads, and so there are specific techniques that are brought back also from Hong Kong as well, I think, to the metropole. So when we talk about the state's role in policing the newly gathering subaltern masses who are clamouring for freedom and justice, it's worth remembering that there's a global pattern there in terms of how those techniques are experimented with, and then brought back to control, to do crowd control, to use the phrase that the police themselves use, on people back in the metropole.
I think it's fair to say you have a really kind of positive analysis of crowd experiences, right? And that's really bound up with your analysis of the crowd as a sort of democratic experience, a democratic experiment. Can you talk to us about the link between democracy and the experience of the crowd?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was one critical moment in my own sort of personal history, journey, etc., or indeed my work, that helped me realise the relationship between how the crowd assembles in public and political power and democracy. And that was the 2010 student protests, which are kind of quite critical to Novara's own history as well, I think.
Yes.
A lot of the founders
now we're on home turf.
Yeah. But there, I was not a student at this point. I was in my 20s. I went to report on the student protests that were happening against the tuition fees bill of 2010 that the the Tory Lib Dem coalition were bringing in, that was going to triple tuition fees and abolish the education maintenance allowance. Scandalous stuff to this day. And I experienced kettling, which is a really useful illustration of the relationship between state violence and police tactics and crowd behaviour and crowd psychology. Essentially, the final day of the student protests on December the 10th, I think it was, 2010, it was the day of the tuition fees vote in the House of Commons, in which it would be finally decided that, and the vote did pass, to triple tuition fees and pass the bill. And the protest was peaceful. It was a sunny day. There was a fairly good atmosphere among the marchers as they set off from Bloomsbury. They lighted 40,000 odd people, I think, in Parliament Square, which wasn't supposed to be part of the demo route, but a few barriers were moved comfortably and carefully aside. And the Parliament Square was occupied, which felt like an important thing in itself, and this is a thread that runs throughout my book, that where a crowd assembles when it is protesting or demanding some sort of change or freedom or justice, the location is often really important. So, in the Paris Commune, the swarming subaltern masses ended up in the Beau Quartier, like in the fancy bits of town. And that itself was a liberatory moment, because they literally wouldn't have been allowed normally. They would have been arrested or sort of kicked out by the cops if they even showed up in the posh parts of town. And so it's important, for a political demo to get near Parliament, which is partly why they've at various points tried banning different types of demos from getting near Parliament. The critical thing with kettling on that day was, and I should explain what kettling is, it's a very particularly popular in Britain. It's not only used in Britain, but we do seem to have a very strong record of using it, particularly in London. It's where riot police gather around a perimeter and go from having what they call soft lines, which is where there might be a row of police officers, but they'll let you walk through into, and you, like if you're on a demo, you'll hear them sometimes shout, okay, hard lines, and that means that the wall kind of, they'll lock arms, they will raise their shields, they'll put their visors down, they become, the stormtroopers essentially, and you are then not allowed out. You've been contained. In fact, the police call it containment. They won't refer to it as kettling, even though literally everybody else calls it kettling. They don't like that word. Words are, choice of words is really important. And the mood on the student protest demo that day changed really rapidly. It also got dark around this point. It was 4:00 in the middle of winter, so it got dark, being London. And news that the tuition fees bill passed also kind of came through around that time. And you cage an animal, it is going to get upset. And while a lot of my book is arguing that, we do not become animals in crowds, people were frustrated and increasingly angry. And at this point, you do start getting people throwing things at the police, fighting with riot cops, trying to break out, because they've been unfairly and I would argue illegally detained. It's something that has been challenged in the High Court and it goes back and forth. But the moment they are still allowed to use this technique. David Lammy is not someone I'm a huge fan of, but he did say something very perspicacious about that particular day in Parliament. He said to Theresa May, "Is it not the point of a kettle that it brings things to the boil?" And that is bang on. Like that is right, exactly, that is, the police call it containment because they think they are containing any problems. What actually happens is that you are antagonizing people by unfairly detaining them, denying them food, water, access to the toilet. They may have other needs, other things they desperately need. You've restricted their freedom. It's essentially like detainment without charge, indefinitely. And it was also 0 degrees centigrade that day. It's worth mentioning as well. So, I then watched people set fire to porta cabins. People used a series of metal barriers to try and storm the Treasury. Like they were using them as a battering ram to get through the double doors of the Treasury. People were throwing things at windows in some cases and smashing windows. All of these sort of what are seen as very negative, destructive, nihilistic behaviours come about because of the aggression of the police in their tactic of suffocating and stifling a protest, which is trying to reach out to the world, which is trying to speak loudly about about its demands for free education.
So you're very careful there to talk initially about how peaceful, how organised, how kind of calm everything was before the intercession of the police. Often that isn't the case, right? And I approach this in a kind of, violence neutral analytic stance for now. Because often you will get people, say in riots, going and like burning cars outside of police stations, right? And in response to that, there is the framework, the discourse that to assemble en masse always has the potential to kind of divest itself of its legitimacy as a sort of democratic assembly by pitching into violence, right? And sometimes the sort of space of possibility there, it seems very much shrinking because, alongside the invention of the public sphere and sort of the decorum that we need to use in the public sphere, there is also the invention of the idea that peace and the crowd are inherently oppositional. So, I'm just wondering how you factor kind of violence into your thinking here. How do you think about the violence of the riot and how that figures into what you think of as the democracy of the crowd and where kind of rationality plays into this? So it's an expansive question.
It's a great question. I mean, one of the challenges I was writing a chapter, I've arranged this book in thematically. There's a chapter about football crowds. There's a chapter about sort of music and carnivalesque crowds. And I was going to have a separate chapter on riot and protest crowds. And I had to do a lot of unpicking of what the difference is between a protest and a riot. Is a riot a protest that's got out of hand? Is it a protest that's had its requests for legitimacy or its calls for justice unheard? And then it's like, well, okay, fine. If you won't listen to us protesting, maybe you'll listen to us rioting.
Right.
One way of approaching that, trying to unpick what the difference is, apart from just the levels of violence or not, is actually the behaviour of the crowd. Riot crowds are composed very differently. They don't. It's very rare. I mean, I really can't think of any examples of something that you would describe as a riot, which involves thousands of people marching in lockstep in the same direction. As part of my career as a journalist, I reported on the London riots in 2011. I was there on Tottenham High Street when it kicked off, or about an hour after it kicked off. I happened to be free that evening and living in North London. It was the only time I've ever had that moment where oh my God, something's happening, grab your notebook, go now. Yeah. And I arrived in Tottenham High Street to find, the riot police still trying to work out what they were doing in terms of they were trying to defend Tottenham police station. But they didn't really, clearly nobody saw it coming, which is one of the other interesting things about riots. After a riot has happened, it's often quite easy to see what the sort of motivations were and where they came from, but they almost always arrive as a surprise, as they did with the far right riots this summer just gone, which maybe we can talk about those in a minute. Riot crowds move in sort of small affinity groups rather than a crowd of hundreds and thousands. They tend to be people who know each other already. In fact, a lot of people I saw on Tottenham High Street that day, including people who were smashing windows and attempting to do a little bit of looting early in the proceedings, were individuals. They were on their own. Now, you could argue that the presence of other people doing the same thing around them is what gave them the confidence to engage in acts of let's say violence against property.
Right, property damage.
Property damage, essentially, yeah. There was no contagion there of violence, which is what traditional crowd theory would argue, that people see someone throwing a brick and think, well, now I better throw a brick. I can say very clearly that there wasn't an aspect of contagion there because there were hundreds of people just watching who weren't taking part. There was an extremely diverse array of Tottenham residents on the high street watching this extraordinary thing happen, watching a double-decker bus being set on fire. That double-decker bus won't have been set on fire by the crowd because there wasn't one really. There was a diffuse series of individuals and groups moving quite furtively because they're aware that their behaviour is against social norms and the law. It's very different to a masks off, fists raised protest where, as I say, thousands of people might be marching in lockstep.
Because you have, a positive sort of quasi-utopian framework for what it is to exist in a crowd, agitating for kind of collective transformation. You are amongst the people, of the people. I am here for strangers as strangers are here for me, etc., etc., etc. Which I've had those experiences, right? Instinctively, that very much resonates with me. But it does pose a formal challenge to us, right? Because when we look at something like the far right riots or like the Nazi rallies, do we want to draw distinctions not only obviously of political content, but also of the kind of experience that people are having? Do we want to kind of lump these in as a sort of a similar psychological phenomenon that might be different from the psychological phenomenon that Gustave Le Bon is describing, but still, is there an overlap? Can we put clear blue water between those kind of processes?
Yeah, it's a really great question, a really, really sort of spiky one as well. That I have thought about is there crowd joy for the Nazi at Nuremberg? Yeah,
right,
probably.
Yeah.
So I was very keen with this book, even though it is a sort of quasi-utopian pie into the joys of the crowd, to the solidarity, kinship, and giddiness that we get in a good crowd that we feel happy to be a part of, that we have great social identification with the other members of. That wasn't going to avoid fascist crowds. And there's a whole chapter about, ranging from the January the 6th marchers to... I found extraordinary connections actually between the way that people behaved and the relationships with power and authority on January the 6th in Capitol Hill a couple of years ago, and go back almost exactly 100 years, Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922, and Hitler's Beer Hall Putsch and attempts to march on Berlin, I think it was, in 1923. Those two in historical, very important historical moments, compared with January 6th and Bolsonaro's the Bolsonaristas who marched into the Brazilian Congress, have a great deal in common. They have a very those protesters have a completely different relationship with power, hierarchy, and authority from a democratic, socialist, or revolutionary crowd. They identify very keenly with a despotic leader or would-be leader, and the totalitarian crowd, particularly this kind of vanguard crowd, which tends to be quite small and tempting to storm the corridors of power. It's what happened on January the 6th. It's what happened with the March on Rome. It's what happened with the Beer Hall Putsch. They are often ex-military people with experience of violence, inured to violence, capable of using weapons, probably owning them. We saw that with the Proud Boys and, a lot of ex-cops or current cops out of uniform, ex-soldiers in the January 6th march. So, the people entering into this kind of crowd are different to begin with. I would then argue their psychology is different because instead of seeking identification, solidarity, and kinship from the rest of the crowd, they are looking upwards towards the dear leader, emptying themselves out and attempting to fill themselves with that identification with the leader and that glorification of the leader. So everything on January 6th was about Trump. It wasn't about a mass movement per se, and they. When the fascist vanguard crowd marches on the corridors of power in an attempt to, establish a coup, as happened on January the 6th, as happened in 1922 and 23, there are some other commonalities. They're often met with very little resistance from the people, and it's a counterfactual that's often posed about January the 6th, but had that been a Black Lives Matter demo that was that well armed, that was marching, demanding the overturning of a democratic election result, there would have been blood flowing down the steps of Capitol Hill.
There would have been open fire.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And similar things happened in the beer hall putsch in Munich. Like, there were people from the established sort of parties of the right, judges and so on, and then you get who sort of essentially let them in. There's little resistance there, because ultimately, given a choice between the democratic, potentially revolutionary socialist crowd from below, the institutions of power, existing power elites, understand that the fascist coup crowd is something that will ultimately uphold most of those types of power. I realise I haven't really answered the question about whether people at Nuremberg experience crowd joy. I mean, a lot of people at Nuremberg, it's a very different kind of crowd, that sort of fascist crowd. Like, that is a spectacle. It's something in which the crowd are, being manipulated to be, in the sense that they are part of the spectacle. Their symmetry, the fact that they're all Sieg-heiling in unison is as important as, in Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will, as the symmetry that you see in the kind of colonnaded backdrops and the tank movements and so on.
Right. When you wrote that there's few words or like no words for crowd that are kind of neutral, the only word that I could come up with was audience, right? Which has a kind of passive spectacle, obviously, to it.
Yes, exactly. Passivity is really, really key there. I mean, actual reports from the Nuremberg rallies reveal a much messier state of affairs than what you see in Triumph of the Will. Like, there was a lot of public urination, there was a lot of boredom, there was there was petty crime. Like, it's something that doesn't ultimately get us around the fact that a lot of people wanted to be there. And a lot of people voted for the Nazis. Like, this shouldn't be surprising, really. Unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think there's things one could pull on there in terms of the experience of crowd joy as something that is sort of delivered by this form of politics, shall we say? Like, that's a kind of it's a psychic reward of like signing up to the far right. You can go to all these like nice fancy rallies with all of your terrible friends, right? And there is this continuity sometimes in the book between fascism and a kind of, should we say, like nudge theory neoliberalism of what the correct relationship between the masses and those who actually have the levers of power should be. It's sort of, the masses aren't kind of like agentive. There's just this sort of libidinal mass urge, often towards violence or towards punishment, that needs to be channeled, and like as a way of laundering forms of elite-driven politics. So I guess my question to you is like, can you tell someone's politics from their approach to the idea of crowds, masses, the herd?
That's such a great question. Yeah, I think so. I mean, as recently as sort of this year, there have been comments from MPs in response to the Palestine demos that, and I think the quote is, that politics belongs in Parliament, not in the streets. And it's something you definitely see from Labour MPs, this idea that, I mean, in fact, it's there in the repeated affirmation that the Labour Party is no longer a party of protest, because that, that was said at Labour conference, wasn't it, by Rachel Reeves, but it's been said by Keir Starmer repeatedly across the last few years. Like, the idea of being a party of protest is something they, a great way for them to distance themselves from Corbyn, but I think it also reveals a suspicion of any sort of mass participatory politics. And, that I think one of the things that the British media hated about the Corbyn movement was that it was so obviously mass participatory. Remember all the headlines about momentum or about or the dismissal of like mass rallies as a technique during Corbyn's election campaigns. There were the very smart people who occupy our positions of punditry in the British press were really sneery about the fact that look at Corbyn's Labour Party just speaking to the party faithful. They'd rather talk to 50,000 people who are already converted than sort of convert one new person. That was very specifically flawed, as it happens. I think this is worth saying as a bit of analysis, because if you do a rally to 50,000 party faithful in, say, Manchester, a city that's always going to be Labour, then you get on the regional news in the evening, and then people in the suburban seats outside that might be swing seats see this mass, the mass popularity of the Corbyn movement, and you do reach beyond speaking to the converted. So I think there's a distinction there even within the two recent versions of the Labour Party in terms of the relationship with the crowd, right? Mm-hmm. The kind of Corbyn skeptics hated, the scene of like, how many hundreds of thousands of people was it singing "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn" at Glastonbury? Like, that really made them sick, because that is not how politics should be conducted. You shouldn't have that many people involved. It should be done by the smart people who are in Parliament, and they say as much very candidly.
I'm wondering what the sort of structural and political and practical importance of the experience of the city is here, because just via the nature of the sort of the metropolis, particularly places like Manchester, places like London, is often like a multi-class, multi-ethnic, multi-gender experience. And I don't know, maybe it's kind of a bit naive or wishy-washy to sort of talk about like the politics of kind of communality or humanization that engenders. But I don't know, is that something that is the power of the crowd, or is that me being sort of misty-eyed?
Well, if it is you being misty-eyed, there's plenty of that in my book. So. Okay. Yeah, I think, I mean, I love cities. I grew up in a city. I could never imagine myself living outside of a city. Cities and crowds are kind of coterminous. Like that's the wrong word, isn't it? Cities and crowds are inextricably linked. Like, you asked me earlier about sort of what the moment of modernism or the arrival of the modern world sort of had to do with the crowd. Well, it's the arrival of all these people in the great cities that suddenly, I mean, in a very just sort of quotidian day-to-day sense, means that the same streets and squares that had been, walked in for centuries was suddenly just a lot busier. Like the population density in cities absolutely soars in the 19th century. I mean, London, where we're sitting right now, is a relatively non-densely populated city compared to a lot of global cities, Tokyo being the obvious example. I mean, there are huge discrepancies there, and yet it is a place of encounter with strangers. They have always been multicultural places relatively to anywhere else. It is a meeting point it is an arrival point. That's what I love about cities, and it's what I love about crowds as well. It's the fact that we might have something to learn or to gain spiritually from encountering people from different backgrounds and encountering them spontaneously. I realized spontaneity is a critical aspect of this when I was writing this book. Like, I am impressed with the scale of the British festival industry, for example. It's vast, but a lot of our cultural experiences, our festive experiences, are being taken down that route of being formal, bureaucratized, organized, gated, ticketed. There's a price for entry. And what I really love, I've just come back from Spain. I love Spain. I've done a lot of work in Spain in the past. One of the many things I love about that is the frequency with which you encounter completely spontaneous, unfenced, free to all ages moments of festivity. So there was like a Festa Mayor, they call it, which is like an annual festival for a very local neighborhood going on in Barceloneta in Barcelona when I was there last week. And I always stumble on things like this, and you'll have everyone from like there was an 85-year-old, at a rough guess, mid-80s woman using a wheelchair, dancing with her like great-granddaughter, presumably, who was about 6. There were, next to them, there was like a couple of gay bear dudes snogging away. There were people of all different ages, probably apart from teenagers, who I think are probably too cool for that sort of thing. But yeah, the idea that people come together outdoors in public for free festivity is, I think, should be a critical part of city life, and it's not something we see a great deal of in our neoliberal Northern European cities like London.
So when we talk about the invention of modernity, that's often bound up with the invention of the individual. Now, there is a kind of conundrum that arises from your work, which is kind of, I guess it's who's afraid of de-individuation, right? When we think about collective joy, and certainly I'm just kind of speaking from my own experience of, being in a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people who are all dancing together, you feel like you do lose a sense of the edges of yourself, and that's kind of part of the experience of collective joy as a separate category, as opposed to just loads of individuals kind of separately being joyful occasionally by happenstance in the same location at the same time, right?
Yeah.
But also in your work you talk about how the individual doesn't lose agency, right?
Yeah.
In those senses, and the bounds of the self still obtain. So I guess how do you kind of balance those two factors?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Like, we do lose a little bit of the edges of ourselves. I think that's a really nice way of phrasing it, and that's the joy of it, right? There's something liberating actually about being in a massive festival sing-along, say, and doing the exact same thing as everybody else. You know, that is a glorious thing. There's something really affirming about that, which my journalist idol, R.I.P. Barbara Ehrenreich, would argue is like something that goes back to our cave people selves, like that when we first emerged out of into sort of small groupings of proto villages and stuff, it was dancing and singing together that bonded us. And so there's an evolutionary imperative to the need to be in a crowd. That's something I completely subscribe to. And yet there are limits to how much we can lose ourselves. And there's one way of sort of giving an example of that is the variety of behaviours that you will see within a crowd. So, I mean, this is basically the argument of my book, is that the crowds do not behave homogeneously. They do not think homogeneously, that every multitude contains multitudes, that while there might be, say in the Parliament Square kettle in 2010, while some people are throwing bricks through windows, other people are telling them not to do that. Like the phrase that crowd
sports.
Yeah, the crowd psychologists use the phrase self-policing, and crowds always self-police. They will like the limits of what you might do in a crowd are conditioned by the sort of social, they would call it the crowd psychologists call it the social identification model. So in the St. Paul's riot in Bristol in 1984, for example, which is the subject of a great deal of like a very seminal study by this great crowd psychologist called Stephen Reicher, he identified that like through doing extensive interviews with participants, studying all the documentary evidence there was of this riot in Bristol in 1984 against racist policing, that there was a story, for example, of some, I don't know, say 14-year-old kids who were about to throw bricks at and trash and set alight to a car that belonged to a random member of the public, I guess. They were held back from doing that by older members of the crowd. They said, no, we're attacking the police. We're only attacking the police.
Right.
The police are the people that cause problems for us in this neighbourhood in St. Paul's. That was an example of self-policing. So the kids don't set, the wayward children who are, they're caught up in the moment. Children are impressionable. I will, grant that. I don't think adults are nearly as impressionable. But yeah, that's a great example of like the solidarity and kinship and social identification of the crowd, i.e. the fact that they all feel like they have something in common, i.e. their bad treatment by the police, and the sort of wider racism and inequality of living in Bristol under Thatcher in the 1980s, means that that conditions their behaviour and that limits their behaviour.
Right. It's always a kind of really surreal fact of riot reporting sort of after the incident, as it were, because there's the insistence that a riot has to be mindless, brainless, apolitical. Yeah. It's like, okay, well, if that was the case, why is it always the police station that is set on fire? I feel like maybe there's some conclusions that could be drawn here, maybe. But I would love to go back to football, right? We started with football.
Yes.
You talk about both the collective experience of the football stadium and particularly the kind of the policing that has evolved in response to this kind of co-evolution of the football crowds and the football policing. I'd like to know some more about that, and I guess as an example of how the police today are thinking about crowd psychology and how that plays into what we might experience of policing, say, in the UK in the 21st century.
Yeah, football crowds are a really useful example because there's no other crowd that is consistently treated quite like it. I'm not saying that crowds of BLM protesters were treated worse, but in terms of like a sporting a crowd that's assembled for leisure, for entertainment, essentially. There's no other sport like it really in terms of how it's viewed by the establishment, how it's described by the media, and how it's policed. That obviously reaches its peak in the 1980s with the thriving violence at football grounds. There's a great book about the sort of peak of 80s hooliganism called Among the Thugs by a New Yorker journalist who sort of threw himself into that, which describe, I'm absolutely not in denial about the absolutely horrendous things that happened, not least because I've read that book, among football crowds or other like among football supporters, particularly in the 70s and 80s, culminating in Hillsborough, which is a very good example of how the establishment sees the crowd as always necessarily prone to violence, in this case because it contains working class men from Liverpool.
Right.
So for people who don't know, Hillsborough is the name of the Sheffield Wednesday football stadium, and it hosted an important FA Cup match in 1989 between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, in which the Liverpool fans, 97 of them died either on that day or eventually. There have been decades of struggle from the families and survivors to attain some kind of justice, which was sort of forever and ever deferred. Been inquiries, there've been endless investigations. There is a modicum of truth that has finally come out now. Is unfortunately a very good example of how the establishment's view of the crowd leads directly to its maltreatment. So any other cultural pursuit or leisure pursuit, there is no way that the game at Hillsborough, in which 97 people died, would have been allowed to go ahead to begin with. Like it would not have passed basic health and safety checks if they had bothered to do them at South Yorkshire Police, which they didn't do. Like they didn't, the basic protocols before a football match were just not carried out because, well, we are herding these mostly working class men into a pen. I mean, they were called pens, but they had large fencing at the front of the Leppings Lane end, where so many people died and were crushed to death. They wouldn't, when it became clear that people were struggling, that they were beginning to suffocate in that end of the stadium, they did not take the basic precautionary measures that absolutely definitely would have saved lives, of like ripping down the fence, because they were like, well, they're Liverpool fans. There's something going on in there. There's a lot of people screaming. It's probably violence, So again, the view of the crowd conditions how the crowd is treated and leads to, actual death. Even when it was clear that people were dying, David Duckenfield, who was in charge in the ground that day, senior South Yorkshire police officer, did not call for ambulances. He called for backup, like police backup, the dog squad, basically, because he was like, well, there's trouble on the pitch, right? Like, even as you could see people out on the pitch, who were concussed or were unconscious already or possibly already dead. It then goes into the media reporting of Hillsborough. That same view of the crowd, the Libonian view of the crowd, is really present there again in the infamous front pages. It wasn't just that, we know about the Sun front page, quite famous, that just tells a series of lies about the Liverpool fans urinated on the dead, and that they pickpocketed like people who were lying prostrate on the pitch. All completely baseless fictions that come from the police via a Conservative MP to the Sun newspaper. That was
flawless chain of evidence.
But like the people involved, it's really telling. That is how the establishment has always viewed the crowd, and Hillsborough is, unfortunately, a very good example of the detrimental effects of that, and of how the establishment kind of joins forces to demonise and delegitimise the crowd. So Hillsborough is, the nadir of that model of policing. It leads to all sorts of very dramatic changes. There is an act of parliament or legislation, at least, and the Taylor Report, which completely transforms football forever and transforms the nature of fandom and crowd membership forever, not least because you have the transfer to all-seater stadiums, which itself kind of, in a way, atomizes to a small extent the crowd by putting them in their own seat.
Right.
You know, like, it's hard to imagine now, but football terraces were, I mean, they were quite uncomfortable. I just about remember, I was a little kid, but like I remember quite how chaotic and strange it was being on a standing football terrace where the crowd can just sort of surge backwards and forwards. You know, there is a compromise option here, which is safe standing, which is coming back into use now, where you have more barriers to prevent people getting crushed, essentially.
Right.
Sounds counterintuitive, but it works, trust me. But yeah, the sort of trends in policing since Hillsborough, policing of football crowds specifically, there have been a couple of moments where progressive crowd psychologists, or I should just say crowd psychologists doing empirical studies, have managed to persuade a few significant police officers or commanders in particular areas to experiment with more progressive models of crowd policing, where you don't immediately send in the riot squad with their batons raised and start smashing heads the moment that one individual, say, you know, calls the cop like a swear word, or like, you know, pisses in the street or whatever, which would be the normal model. It's like collective punishment, essentially.
It's crazy that beating people on the head with sticks is not the answer to everything.
Yeah, it turns out it actually makes people quite mad.
Yeah.
And then they get a bit more jumpy and shouty and violent than they might have been otherwise.
Right.
And that is something that they've experimented with this at the Glasgow Derby, which is a, at best, fractious encounter between Celtic and Rangers fans. You know, there's a long history of like sectarian chanting, which is technically banned, but obviously happens every single week or every single time they play each other, and violence between those two sets of fans. They were persuaded, the sort of head honchos at Police Scotland, by some crowd psychologists this was in the late 2000s, to as an experiment, try hanging back, letting the two sets of fans just call each other names, maybe even do a little bit of sectarian chanting and swearing at each other, let off a bit of steam, and then enter the ground and doing the same on the way out, but without sending in the riot squad, and just, you know, keeping them tucked away maybe around the corner in a van. And they saw levels of arrest and violence drop. And that shouldn't be a surprise at all. It is the same principle as kettling. If you antagonise people, even the appearance of riot police.
Because they are scary.
They are supposed to look scary.
Right.
Like, it's a performance of like state power and state violence, and it is supposed to be antagonistic, and that works. And there are a few senior cops who have actually listened and have trialed this sort of stuff, but they really, really are fighting an uphill battle to use what they call them police liaison officers. You see them at some demos now as well in blue bibs. I think a lot of our friends and comrades are rightly suspicious of those people, those cops, as intelligence gathering, like a front for intelligence gathering. And I think that's bang on. I think they are doing intelligence gathering. I also argue in the book, and I don't know if some of our comrades won't like this so much, that like you do actually see a drop off in the amount of conflict when they use police liaison officers rather than the riot squad. Like, there is, you know, we don't want to see our, you know, fellow demonstrators fighting with the police and getting arrested. It doesn't end well for them. So it's a tricky one that I don't know how I feel about.
Right. To raise another tricky question, right?
Yeah.
And I feel kind of conflicted about this topic within this context, right? Because intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, violence against women is often talked about like a kind of working class problem, which it absolutely isn't. And particularly when we've just talked about the kinds of violence that the police indulge in, we know that police officers are way more likely to be domestically abusive than people in other professions and sectors of society. However, I want to kind of use this as an example to think about the kind of sort of sticky edges of what we might consider like collective experience. Because we know that, like, win or lose, on match days, especially like important match days, say, England is playing in the World Cup, that kind of thing, intimate partner violence spikes, right? Yeah. So I guess how do we wrangle with the question of like what collective joy and that heightened emotional experience means within a sort of hopefully democratic experience of the crowd, when a lot of people's socialization means that to experience heightened emotion is to take that out on people that they have social power over. I guess what does that mean for the democratic experiment that is crowd living?
Yeah, so it's such a good point. It's worth saying as well, like my many years going to football matches, even at my I would like to think relatively progressive, chilled family club, as they call them slightly patronisingly. I support this small team called AFC Wimbledon in South London. I have witnessed or heard like racist comments from fellow fans, sexist comments from fellow fans. Not often, like maybe once or twice each. Also, homophobia definitely as well. I think I'm right in saying every single time it has been challenged by other fans. So one person stands up, says something racist or sexist, they are shouted down. That I'm pleased to say that I wasn't the only one who was like, "You shut the fuck up."
Right.
That's a good example of self-policing. But yeah, there is absolutely something about being in a football crowd that permits, like the social norms of membership of that football crowd are that I definitely use swear words I would not use like walking down the street on my own at a random passerby. That would be weird. But I will shout them at a referee. Yeah. So there are limits of our sort of behaviour that are changed by membership of that crowd. Absolutely. The idea that someone who is liable or like capable of committing violence against their domestic partner will go to a football match, presumably drink a lot. Also cocaine, huge thing in football now, which is, I don't know how relevant that is, but like there's a huge surge in cocaine use among football fans.
Right. No, I think I think it is relevant, right? Because it's like, as is a theme here, it's like, okay, what do you attribute to the fact of the crowd and what is a kind of incidental add-on, right? Like, is it the emotive experience of like, and like heightened sensibilities, or is it like all of the coke, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'd like my sort of pro-crowd instincts are urging me to sort of say, well, if somebody is prone to committing an act of domestic violence or capable of it, and then drinks a lot and does a lot of coke and is angry about the football result, then they're, well, without the alcohol and the cocaine and the predisposition, they wouldn't have done that, right? But I think you're probably right. There is something about the heightened emotions and adrenaline of crowd membership and the experience of the match. It's like, I don't think you can pin all of that on the fact that this individual that we're talking about who is going to go and commit an act of violence after the England game, it can't all be pinned on the booze and the coke. There probably is something about that adrenaline, that sense of heightened emotion that they've gathered from being in that football crowd. I think that's an unavoidable likelihood, I would say.
Right, it's the kind of one of the things that we've been talking about in terms of the forms of collective joy that interact with the ways in which people have been socialized towards, racism or homophobia or misogyny or whatever it happens to be. And when we think about the kind of crowd legitimation of those forms of thinking, something that is, and I mean this as a neutral fact rather than like a critique, striking by its absence in your account of the history of crowds, is the internet. Right. Yeah. Which is often where crowds start to like put down their roots, right? Particularly in, say, student riots in January the 6th, right? That's as a communality between the two of them. And I sound like a massive liberal here that can't tell the difference between, sound and content like a golden retriever. certainly in the last 10, 20 years, that has been a form in which the crowd takes. Was that something that you think it isn't so much an important story because what happens in IRL, shall we say, is the real story here? Or was that something that you just kind of that's a whole another issue for another book?
I think sort of more the latter, in that I definitely had a mooted chapter about online mobs, or the description of people online as online mobs, and eventually realised I was so sort of fixated on the overlap between the physical crowd and the psychological crowd. It's a distinction that crowd psychologists often make, that, sort of 150 people in a major train station who are all walking in different directions and all have completely different agendas and ideas. They're a physical crowd, but they're not really a psychological crowd. They're not bound by anything significant, by any social identification. They're just people going in different directions. But the existence of an online crowd is that's a purely psychological crowd, although it can lead to physical crowds. The idea that things that the political movements can now begin their life through people finding each other online. One of the stories from the 2011 riots that I found quite interesting, if ultimately terrible for the people involved, was that there were two guys who were put in jail for posting on Facebook an incitement, or basically creating an event on Facebook that was why don't we riot in Norwich tomorrow, in Norwich city centre? Nobody turned up, including the person that posted it, and they still got done and imprisoned. Yeah.
Shit.
So the prospect of creating a real physical IRL crowd that was never fulfilled was still enough to sort of get this person a conviction. It was happened to two different people. I am interested in online, the way that online, particularly people who are clamoring for some kind of politics that is outside of sort of the norms of the mainstream, are very quickly dismissed as the woke mob. Will often be used. It's always the same sort of language that's used to describe IRL crowds. So a Twitter mob is often one anonymous account who's said something mean to Jess Phillips. And it's a complete miscategorization, isn't it? I argue that there is no such thing as a mob, that a mob is just a crowd that you don't like, basically.
Right.
It's a crowd that you're trying to dismiss, and people on the left do it for describing far-right crowds as well.
I am the demos, you are the crowd, they are the mob.
Yeah, 100%, exactly.
Right.
That's how you conjugate it. But yeah, I do find it interesting. I just think there's so much that's interesting and so much to say about physical crowds, how they're policed, how they behave, that I will leave that for the tech theorists, I guess.
I want to end on, what was something you came across in your research that, to return to the kind of utopian spirit of the book, that you thought yes, that's the kind of crowd democracy I want to see more of. That's my collective joy. That's my bag.
I think so. I took myself off to Cadiz in the south of Spain as a really, really important and necessary bit of journalistic research. Not just because it happens in February in Andalusia and it's a lot, and I get SAD. No, I'd been dying to go to the Cadiz Carnival for forever, having spent a lot of time reporting from southern Spain. It's a pre-Lenten carnival that happens in February, like the one in Rio. It's one of the largest in Europe. And it sort of has a very different set of behaviours from Notting Hill Carnival, which is my home passion, I suppose, as a Londoner. Cadiz Carnival, instead of if Notting Hill Carnival is about massive sound systems playing reggae, then Cadiz Carnival is about groups of singers, generally called chirigotas, who walk around singing satirical songs about people in power or famous people or whatever, that are written that year. So they will always be new songs, even if they're sometimes written to sort of traditional musical arrangements. And they will wander around at street level just singing to anybody. So they're not there's no great stage where they all appear. It happens on street corners. So you walk around Cadiz. Basically, it's a week-long party. I mean, it's exhausting. My step count has never been higher, even at Notting Hill Carnival. Right. I think it was, it's a very physical experience. You kind of leave it with your legs humming with kind of lactic acid and absolutely kind of feverishly exhausted. But it's hard to. I found it very hard to go home and go to bed every night because I would turn a corner thinking, okay, right, I'm done now. It's 4 a.m. I'm really ready for bed, and discover another singing group or like an impromptu dance. Just someone's got a sound system and is playing a bit of flamenco, and people are having a little dance. Like complete strangers are having a dance there. It's the self-organized grassroots, completely open to all. Kind of festivity that I think all of our cities need a lot more of, not least London, that I strongly believe is sort of how we ought to behave and how we always historically have behaved as social animals. It's only the bloody Reformation and centuries of anti-pagan or anti-festive kind of legislation that means that we don't have these sorts of things going on all the time anymore.
And that drive-by against the Reformation is probably where we will have to leave it. Dad, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. It's been such a treat. I've really enjoyed it.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support or face the consequences.